welcome again. And I am looking at an engagement for the next 1.5 or 2 hours, depending on the kind of questions you have. But I am pinning my presentation at around, I think, anywhere between 1 hour 15 minutes and 1 hour 30 minutes. So it is basically looking at gender studies, the origins, the beginnings, and the current trends, which you need to be familiarized with if you are looking at a career and further research in this area, and also for your PhD if you want to problematize a particular aspect of gender studies. So I will start with my presentation, and yeah, so this is not the start, one sec, yeah. So what I'm going to do is I am going to start with feminism, because if you are looking at gender studies, you have to go to feminism, which is the kind of beginning of gender studies, what it connotes. Very briefly, we will look at the first and the second waves of feminism, mentioning the thrust, their political ramifications, the gains, the fallouts, and the major works that came to be the cornerstones and that influenced these movements. Then we look at how they influenced women's studies and literary theory, feminist literary theory. And then we move on to the third wave of feminism, its relevance and the need of this third wave, which emerged from the first and the second waves. And from there, the multiple schools and trajectories of feminisms around the globe, because today it's no longer feminism, it is feminisms. Right? So that's that. And then, of course, we will be looking at gender, the beginnings of gender studies, which coincides with the third wave of feminism, and especially at Judith Butler and her work and her argument as a theorist and as a philosopher who takes this discourse beyond feminism and beyond the gender binary, and examines and we'll be examining what she means by gender performativity and how she theorizes sexuality. So this is my rough plan. So let's start with where we ought to start. Feminism. Now let's look at the Oxford Dictionary definition of feminism. Now, as you can see, I have put two words in bold over here. Oxford Dictionary defines feminism as the belief and aim that women should have the same rights and opportunities as men, and the struggle to achieve this aim. So now these two words, same and struggle, obviously imply that there is inequality and there is a fight involved, there is some kind of a strife involved. So obviously the word feminism does not resonate very well with the general populace, as in people outside the academia or outside people who are not into some kind of activism. It doesn't really resonate very well. And you may have come across celebrities, especially women, Bollywood stars, Hollywood stars, who shy away from the word feminism. They do not want to be associated with it. They do not want to identify with it, right? So, in fact, I have some interesting quotes, which I was looking up how feminism resonates today, and I came across these very interesting quotes and excerpts on the net from articles. There's a woman in South Korea who says that people in her country think there's a certain idea, there's a certain notion about a feminist who is someone who is antisocial. She is a man-hating person. She's an unattractive woman, and she's totally unlovable by men. And then there's this another woman from the US, and she said, feminism is still a bad word in my country. It has got a lot of negative connotation. It's got a lot of baggage. As feminism is actually understood to be to mean that we hate men. Now, where does all this come from? So basically, this is because underlying feminism is the false understanding or the misconceived notion that when feminists are talking about equality, they are actually talking about being the same as men. So, feminism does not claim that women are the same as men. Th- What they're talking about is equality in the realm of status, with regard to status, rights, and opportunities. As you can see, Eunice Maya Kamami clearly says that equality isn't about being the same, it's about having the same status, rights, and opportunities as men. And here I have a kind of a very popular slogan which went with the wave of feminism, which says feminism is the radical notion that women are people. So there's a paradox there that it claims it's radical, and through that claim, it tries to imply that women are often objectified, commodified. They are not treated as individuals. They are not treated as people. So, to really understand what feminism today is, well, feminism is not just feminism, it's feminisms, as you can see. I've added this S to the title of this slide. And let's look at something which I extrapolated from Rosemary Tong's book. The name of the book is given below. And she says feminism is, or the way feminists ought to think today is in an interdisciplinary, intersectional, and interlocking kind of manner. So these are the kind of adjectives that best describe the way we feminists think. So, in other words, feminism as activism, as theory, as consciousness raising has come a long way today. And today, what we have is feminisms and not feminism as one grand, global, overarching, grand narrative that claims to suffuse and encompass, all kinds of issues related to women or the predicament of every woman. No, no one is claiming that feminism is trying to do anything like that because there are multiple trajectories today. However, to trace this movement and to trace its journey, we go to the roots of feminism, and that's the first wave of feminism, which could be seen as a movement that took over almost entire the whole of the Western world in the 19th and the early 20th century. And the landmark work of this period was Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women. So, what was this feminism focusing on? It was primarily focusing on the women's voting rights, their political and legal rights, and um, it kind of emphasized the suffrage. It centered around the suffrage movement, and it claimed that female subordination is rooted in a set of legal and political and customary constraints that restricts women from entering the public sphere and realizing their full potential. And the first wave wanted to correct this discrepancy which existed in education, in the realm of in the professional sphere, of course, with regard to property rights, voting rights, and things like that. So, and I think first wave, although we call it the first wave, I would say that the first wave is extremely relevant even today when we come across the very common phrase glass ceiling. I'm sure you all have heard of this phrase. Now, the metaphor being that there's this invisible ceiling which stops women from rising, from self determination, and from expressing themselves completely, and from progressing at some point, implying that somehow that they are inferior to men, or they are not as efficient or as competent or as capable as men. They just don't have it in them. They are not go-getters. They compromise when it comes to work-life balance. They choose life over work, family over profession, and things like that. In fact, there's even the way society looks at women even today. There's this, for example, there's this ongoing debate in the Indian Army on whether to train women officers to become commandos. And there's a lot of resistance because and there are arguments being put forth where you have very senior officers at very senior levels, at the level of lieutenant generals and major generals, saying that, what if a woman becomes a prisoner of war? What would be the implications of her being captured? Because obviously, a woman is not just an individual, she is a sexualized being. So there are ramifications to her being a prisoner of war as opposed to a male prisoner of war. Also, another argument which these senior officers who are decision makers will often make is that most of the Jawans and the lower level recruits in the Indian army, they come from rural backgrounds, and they would not be willing to take orders from a woman. They can't, they will not be able to accept a woman in an authoritative position because they are used to women who are veiled and who serve them. So that's the kind of argument which we are still facing. In fact, I recently happened to watch an interview on YouTube where Karan Thapar was interviewing a very senior army officer, and this was the crux of the argument. You want to check out how the first wave feminism is relevant even today, then I'll suggest, and the meaning of the glass ceiling, then I'll suggest. I'm not endorsing any series or any program, but there's this series called The Test Case on Alt Balaji, and you can check out on Alt Balaji. It's a lovely series, and I think it addresses this glass ceiling very well. So, though feminism, this first wave of feminism, had a distinct connect with the abolition of slavery, it was mostly the white woman's struggle and mostly the white woman's desire to be on a par with the white man. So there was nothing of the black woman or her concerns in this first wave of feminism. But nonetheless, it was a requirement. It was high time that women came out in the public sphere and they voiced their concerns, their predicaments, they addressed their subordination, their subordinate position in society. Now, moving on to second wave feminism. Now, where I say the first wave feminism is a need, I call the second wave feminism a reaction. And we can roughly put it as the 20 years from 1960 to 1980. Now, why do I call it a reaction? What was it a reaction to? Second wave feminism, interestingly, was a reaction to the renewed domesticity and the renewed or the revival of the housewife after the Second World War. Now, what happened was during the wars, the men were away fighting, and a lot of men died. And it was the women who took up jobs, and they started managing work and family. And they were pretty much on their own. They were earning, they were looking after the family, they were raising their children. They had pretty independent and autonomous lives. But after the war, with unprecedented economic growth with respect to the United States, because it emerged as one of those few nations which benefited out of the war. There were rich households, the baby boom, as we all know, and the revival of the housewife and the reinstatement of the man in the public sphere. So there was this whole anxiety that women have taken over the public sphere. So they were again relegated to the domestic space, and men were kind of put back in the public sphere so that they could look after, they could kind of call the shots in the external world. Now, obviously, this was propagated through popular literature. There was an idealized projection of domesticity and the bliss of wifehood and motherhood. And around 1960s, you had a rebellious generation of feminists loudly proclaiming that in order to be fully liberated, enfranchisement, voting rights was not enough. It had to go beyond that, each implying that the woman's right over her body, claiming ownership of herself, uh, having the same rights as she enjoyed earlier. These were very important. And again, two key works of the second wave, which influenced this whole movement, in fact, which shaped this movement, which brought forth some of the key issues of the movement. A was Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. I'm sure you're all familiar with this canonical work, which came out in 1949, and her famous line from her book, in which Beauvoir says, "One is not born, but becomes a woman." So, in other words, she's saying that a woman is a construct. She's a historically produced being, and she's a project in becoming. Uh, so the way she needs to appear, the way she needs to present herself, the way she needs to talk, to act, to respond, everything is taught to her. She assimilates everything. She's conditioned. She is raised in a way that she's conditioned to behave, to display certain qualities which make her a woman. That's the key argument which second sex kind of posits. And this conditioning of the woman relegates her to the domestic space where she gets entangled and immersed in domestic work, in household chores, in work that is repetitive and cyclic and never ending. So she's stuck in her immanence and she's never given a chance for transcendence, which men have a chance to, because they step out of the house and they are out there in the big world, in the brave new world, exploring, uh, experiencing adventures, cracking, making new breakthroughs, exploring untrodden terrains, and so on and so forth. Whereas the woman is caught enmeshed in the same kind of cyclical work, which is detrimental to her psyche, to her emotional and mental well-being, and at some level, it manifests through her body, through the psychological dilemmas which she experiences. Another key work was that of Betty Friedan, and it was called The Feminine Mystique. Again, a path breaking work where Friedan actually exposes the, uh, the again, the problem. She problematizes the whole notion of glorified wifehood, glorified motherhood. She um, she she talks about, she urges the woman to take ownership of her body. She analyzes how the female body is actually commodified. It is used as a reproductive machine so that the state keeps functioning. So the woman produces babies, she supports the man, then the man works for the state, and then her children grow up, she's the caregiver, and then if there's a girl, she again gets into the mother's shoes and she becomes the caregiver, and the man again serves the state. So that's the dynamic. So she said this is how the woman's body is used primarily for reproducing and for caregiving. And she emphasized, um, she brought to the foreground the whole issue of unpaid labor, that is the thankless and the repetitive and never ending household work, right? The work of a housewife and the number of hours she puts in without being paid in return. And if women were paid for that, the ramifications of that on the GDP and the economy of any country. So that again influenced the second wave. So it would not be wrong to say that the second wave uh, highlighted economic opportunities, and sexual freedom, along with civil liberties. But this second wave had the old school feminists who were moderate and reformist, and then they had the very radical and revolutionary kind of feminists. And that is, I think, where the point when people started getting a little wary and intimidated by the word feminism. But the good thing was that the second wave also addressed issues like domestic violence, marital rape, which was never discussed before this period. There was no concept of marital rape and reproductive rights of women. Their right to legalize abortion. There was a movement to legalize abortion, as you can see from the picture which I have put on the slide. So these were some of the core issues of second wave feminism. We'll look at the political gains and the fallouts. So what happened was, and a significant political gain was the emergence of women's studies. So finally, women's studies got a slot, a space in the academia. Women's issues, women's problems, women's predicaments, their dilemmas, uh, the whole activism of the first wave and second wave finally led to enabling or creating a kind of space for women's studies in the academia. So that was a significant political, a tangible gain, you can say. But radical feminism also led to feminist sex wars. Now, what do I mean by feminist sex wars? Now, again, second wave, like the first wave, was very much a white middle class feminist movement. But within that movement also, there were factions. So there was, for example, on the woman's body, on reproductive rights, there was one faction of white feminists who saw this whole idea of reproduction and the woman's ability to reproduce as key to her identity, as essential to her being, as something that made her very special, which men didn't have. So they kind of foregrounded the reproductive ability of the woman. On the other hand, there was another faction of feminists who critiqued this and who said no, uh, the woman's body is exploited primarily because of her reproductive abilities, and we need rights over abortion, rights to selectively reproduce, rights to not reproduce at all. So they had a fallout. Then over pornography, there was one group of feminists who saw pornography as objectification of the female body, exploitation of her body, and making the female body available for male gaze. Whereas there was another faction of women who didn't see this as violence on the female body at all. They saw it as self-expression, self-liberation, and a woman's, rightful choice, her freedom to do whatever she wants with her body. So, in fact, they locked horns on a lot of issues, and they didn't see eye to eye on a lot of common. So there was not much common ground, and therefore there were these feminist sex wars. Another area was the mainstream white feminists were heterosexual. So there were lesbians also within that movement, and these lesbians, they were very critical of the heterosexual feminists because they felt that, oh, our fight is against men, and you're sleeping with your enemy at night, and during the day he's your adversary. So how does that happen? So there was also a fallout on that front. And of course, the second wave never bothered to assimilate or accommodate the concerns of Black women or women of color. So, to give you an example, while white women were concerned with obtaining birth control for all, women of color were at risk of sterilization because of these same medical and social advances. So, you had Native American, African American, and Latina groups who documented and publicized sterilization abuses in their communities so that there would be their population could be controlled. This was in the 1960s and the 70s. And it showed that these women had been sterilized without their knowledge, without their consent. And in fact, in the 1970s, a group of women even founded the Committee to End Sterilization Abuse. The acronym is CESA, to stop this racist population control policy begun by the federal governments in 1960s. So obviously the second wave feminist movement also didn't have much in common with the with the concerns of the non-white, uh, the women coming from the non-white communities, from other races. And it was also criticized for being a very wide, very middle class women's movement. For instance, if middle class white women were fighting for their right to, uh, say, right to work, to enter the public sphere, there were black women who were fighting for their right not to work because they were overworked. Right. Uh, but let's look at, so we have seen how it affected society and how it did have some political gains. So going back on that significant gain, which I was talking about a while ago, there was the emergence of feminist literary studies in the academia, and gynocriticism uh, was a kind of school or a discipline that came into being. It was the result of second wave feminism, and what were gynocritics or feminist theorists who claim to be engaged in gynocriticism want to do? Their fundamental preoccupation was to analyze the discriminatory and stereotypical depictions and representations of women in texts by men. So men, when they uh, actually, if you go to see it, if you consider, women authors were not taken seriously at all. They were outside the pale of the literary canon. So all great literature was produced by men. And how were women depicted in this literature? They were passive beings. Things happen to them. They need to be protected. So they were either deified or mythologized, or they were demonized, they were villainized. So there was a very unidimensional kind of projection of women. So either they were, and mostly they were shown as victims or the epitome of modesty and good behavior and passivity. So gynocritics, in fact, looked at these texts critically, and they also foregrounded texts written by women authors which had not seen the light of the day, or which had not been mainstreamed, and which was of course not a part of the canon. And they tried focusing on issues that were central to women, issues related to childbirth, related to the house, the realm of the private, the home, the household, the domesticity, then the predicament of the woman, her dilemma, mm, the feeling of entrapment. Uh, is it going okay? Am I audible? I just thought I lost connection. I
No,
hope
no, no.
it's okay. Okay, all right.
You're quite audible. Yes, you're
Okay,
quite
okay.
audible.
Right. So there were issues. These texts focused on things like motherhood, domesticity, the private sphere, etc. And gynocritics also were concerned with analyzing and foregrounding um, all these texts and the concerns expressed in these texts. Another thing which gynocriticism did was it looked at the language used by women authors. In fact, there was a professor of university professor of English, Elaine Showalter, who was at the forefront of this movement, and she even wrote a book called A Literature of Their Own. So this is an iconic text from this period. But I think the most iconic text would be The Mad Woman in the Attic, by which came out in 1979, which was written by again two university professors who were actually running a course, and it was a series of lectures which later uh, they converted it into a book, and it was called The Mad Woman in the Attic by uh, uh, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar. Now, if you look at the picture on the screen, it clearly shows you. I've tried to make the slide interesting by putting the mad woman in the attic so that it gets imprinted in your mind. It's a very interesting theory which these two women come up with. Uh, you must be familiar with this novel of Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre. Now, in this novel, Jane Eyre is a governess, and she is from very modest. She's from a modest background, and she works in a rich man's house who has a daughter who she's looking after. But this man is single now, so there's an aura of mystery surrounding this man who is called Edward Rochester. And over a period of time, Rochester and Jane, they fall in love with each other, and they are about to get married. Just the day before, a day before she's going to get married to him, she confronts Rochester's wife. She confronts a woman who she's told is Rochester's wife, but who is kept locked away in a room. Her name is Bertha Rochester, and she is the mad woman in the attic. So she's an animal like woman who is locked away, who makes animal like sounds, and who Rochester has kept hidden from the public eye. Now, what Gilbert and Gobar saw in Bertha Rochester was a projection of female anxiety. They felt that the woman author, the female author, in trying to become an author, the very act of writing was an act of transgression, because you were entering a male space. The literary space was dominated by men, and you are trying to encroach upon this sacred space, which results in a lot of anxiety in the female author. So the female author feels pressurized on the one hand to depict and to create characters which conform to societal norms, or which conform to expectations of a patriarchal and a malist society. A character like Jane Eyre, who's very angelic, compassionate, and she's got all those traditional feminine qualities which men would also depict as women having in their text. On the other hand, the anxiety which is building up, which is mounting inside the psyche of the female author, gets manifested. It's projected externally onto someone like a Bertha Rochester. So she is the manifestation of this female anxiety and the compulsion to show the other side, the darker side of woman, to demonize and to dehumanize the woman. So that's the reading which Gilbert and Gubar offer. And in fact, this really gives a very new angle to looking at female texts, or texts written by women authors. Now, something which was happening in in the Anglophone world, uh, could we could see a parallel of that happening in the Francophone world. So where you had gynocritics in the Anglophone world, you had literature feminine, which was proposed, which was this theory uh, came up in the essay called The Laugh of Medusa by Hélène Cixous, who was a psychoanalytic feminist. She drew a lot from Freud and Lacan, and she also deconstructed a lot of what these psychoanalysts said. And Hélène Cixous' main argument was that language has an inherent bias in it. It has a bias against women. It is a construct of patriarchy. Now, what does she mean by that? To give you a very simple example, if I say we use the word man. Now, man is used to represent both man and woman. We say manpower, right? We say we are losing so many man hours every day, or uh, uh, or the use of the pronoun he, which represents both he and she, right? So this is the kind of inherent sexism which language has. And Cixous's claim was, how on earth can women be comfortable with this kind of language which does not even belong to them? So where second wave feminists were talking about taking ownership of your body, reclaiming your body, Hélène Cixous was talking about taking ownership of language and writing style and taking ownership over language. She says she was of the opinion, and she argued, how could women writers feel comfortable speaking or expressing themselves in an alien tongue So she urged women writers to write their bodies, not write with their bodies, but write their bodies. Now, where does she get this idea from? So, if you look at psychoanalysis, and the whole idea of lack, where woman is non-man, as in she is the manifestation of the lack in man. That's what the psychoanalysts uh, proposed. Whether it was Freud who was doing it through the penis envy, or the theory of the penis envy, or Lacan, who spoke about language as being phallocentric, phallus being the symbolic penis in the realm of language, right? So women obviously didn't have the phallus. So how could they write? So Helen Sixous told them, you write with white ink, you write your bodies. Unlike men, you don't have a centralized pleasure point, you don't have a centralized organ. So she urges women to constantly, to continually disrupt, dismantle, counter, challenge, contest the logical, sequential, stable language of men. And she says poetry is a much better way of expressing yourself than prose. So, in a way, she's also urging women to just unburden themselves of the from the weight of unencumber themselves from the weight of literary paternity, because women don't have mothers to fall back on, literary mothers to fall back on. So create something, write your bodies, and develop a completely different style, which she calls literature, literature feminine. You have Luz Irigaray, who is another psychoanalytic feminist, saying something similar, where she in fact shows how to use language differently. She uses a style called mimesis, and she urges women to come up with their own styles. Now, both gynocriticism and literature feminine, these theories have been criticized because though they sought to empower women, though they sought to uh, urge women to find their own inner self, their individuality as writers, and they foregrounded the concerns of women, they foregrounded women as literary individuals. They are also accused of essentializing women. So, what does this mean? It means that if you are looking at a particular text as a gynocritic, you are actually looking for certain features. So you predetermine, and you are involuntarily categorizing the text as something by a woman author. So you're falling in the same trap, right, of confining, labeling, homogenizing, and categorizing. Though you're claiming that you're allowing them individuality, you are certainly looking at certain features, certain characteristic traits that should manifest in women's writing, so that you can classify it as women's writing. So this is the criticism of these two theories, right? Uh, so obviously, now that we have a good idea of the first and the second waves of feminism and their impact on literary theories, and also the criticism, uh, if we look at the second wave and the first wave and how they failed to incorporate the concerns of women of color or black women, women of different ethnicities, and in the realm of the academia, where they were again trying to categorize or compartmentalize women and homogenize them, the natural trajectory would be the third wave of feminism, right? So I call the third wave feminism a reflection on the first and the second wave and all that happened in the political realm, in the academic realm, and in the social realm. So we can roughly put it between 1990 and 2010. And what was the third wave all about? Obviously, intersectionality. The third wave realized that oppression is not only on the grounds of gender, there are intersections. You're not oppressed only because you are a woman. So sometimes your oppression is invisibilized, perhaps because you belong to a particular race. So when it came to the Black movement, uh, Uh, when it came to slavery and the whole issue of racism, black women's concerns were invisibilized because race became more important, right? So there are always intersections. To give you an example of, say, if you've read Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, this is about a small girl called Piccola Breedlove. Now, Piccola Breedlove is thrice marginalized. Why? Because A, she's a girl, B, she's black, and C, she's poor. So you have intersections of race, gender, and class. And you have to look at gender oppression in a bigger context. And therefore, you cannot homogenize women's problems or treat them as one common problem, right? So, an acknowledgement and acceptance of this fact, and which led to the emergence of new feminist currents and theories. In an Indian context, it would be, say, for example, we are going to look at the Indian context in detail. So, but to just give you an example, it would be maybe the condition of the Indian Muslim woman or the Indian Dalit woman, or even the upper caste Hindu woman in colonial India. If you look at the practice of sati, for instance, a Dalit woman never performed sati. It was only an upper caste Hindu woman who was forced to perform sati. So there you see the intersection of gender and caste, and sometimes also class. So acknowledging this intersectionality. So, of course, we can't deny that the third wave feminism had its groundwork done by the second wave, which led to a lot of tangible outcomes, which we saw earlier, like the emergence of women's studies in the academia, and some of the tangible results which the second wave uh, could bring about or lead to. These gains included equal access to education, public discussion about the abuse and rape of women, access to contraception and other reproductive services, including the legalization of abortion, which was a landmark decision. The creation and enforcement of sexual harassment policies for women in the workplace. This was a very significant contribution of second wave feminism. The creation of domestic abuse shelters for women and children, childcare services, educational funding for young women, and of course, women's studies programs. So, third wave obviously rode on second wave. The third wave coinage. Now, there's a very interesting incident around the third wave coinage of feminism. Where did this third wave term come from? So, this can be attributed to the Anita Hill case. Now, Anita Hill was a woman of color who accused Clarence Thomas, an African American judge who had been nominated to the United States Supreme Court, of sexual harassment. Now, of course, Thomas was a powerful man on his way to becoming a judge, so he denied those accusations as high tech lynching. He called it high tech lynching. Now, after extensive debate, the United States Senate voted 52 to 48 in favor of Thomas, and he went on to become a Supreme Court judge. But in response to this decision, there was a magazine called Miss Magazine, and it published an article written by Rebecca Walker, and that is, she's a journalist. So this article's title was Becoming the Third Wave, in which she stated, I'm not a post feminist feminist, I am the third wave. So that's how you get the coinage. And in that article, an important question was asked, that when will progressive black men prioritize my rights and well-being? So it's a woman asking, it's a black woman asking. She says, I do want racial equality, but not at the expense of my dismissal, at the expense of invisibilizing me. So within the racial discourse also, there has to be space for a discourse around the predicament or the problems or the issues or the exploitation of the black woman, right? And this And that becomes a very defining feature of third wave feminism, that personal narratives become feminist theory in the third wave. Also, I think with the whole emergence of cultural studies as a discipline, the whole attempt to collapse the or dismantle the elitism and the kind of ivory tower, the academicians who are inside their ivory tower, looking at the world through a particular lens, distancing themselves and analyzing, presenting a very objective view of the world. It was an attempt to dismantle all this, and it became a very grassroots movement. The, the third wave of feminism is all about your personal story. And also with the IT revolution, the internet, social networking, I think it gave people across the globe, men and women both from around the globe, to voice their concerns, to interact on a worldwide platform, and to voice their concerns. And each narrative becomes, contributes to the theory. Now, second wave had also focused considerably on sexual liberation, but third wave feminism just took it to the next level. Now, what do I mean by that? Uh, so, what the third wave feminists defined sexual liberation as was that they said that first we need to become conscious of ways our gender identity and sexuality have been shaped by society, and then intentionally construct and become free to express our authentic gender identity. So the first step is that we understand how we are inserted into a society, how we are born into uh, a discourse or into patriarchy. uh, I could just hear some sound. Is it okay? Should I continue?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I think that was by mistake that Kinjal hit the mute option.
No problem. No problem. No problem. All
Shyaonti,
right.
any point
Yeah.
of time, if you want people to sort of just like reflect on what is going on, and
Okay.
if you wish to take any questions, so on whatever,
I don't see the questions
maybe
option. I how ha ha. Okay. Okay.
you,
Yeah. Got
you
it.
can just give them a minute, and
Right.
if they have any question, they will share. Otherwise, we can continue. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm just taking a look at all the chats, and there don't seem to be any questions so far. But in case you have questions, please unmute yourself, and you can turn on your video so that I can see you and you can come up with your questions, or we continue and we can take questions later. Whatever.
Yeah. In the meanwhile, I have a request to Sapna Machi. Sapna, if you can hear me, I just have a request to you. Please turn off your video. That option is right at the bottom of your screen. If you take the cursor towards the bottom, you will see three signs in the center, and the rightmost sign is that of a video. You just have to click on that, and the video will be turned off. Sapna, if you can hear me. Yeah. Okay, it seems that there are no questions so far
At this
at
point.
this point.
At this
So
point.
Vimla just has said something.
Yes. So I was addressing
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
In fact, I was.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, please go ahead.
Mm, mm. So yes, Vimla, I just saw what you are. I saw what you have written in the chat box. You said women are inserted in society. It's not just women; it's men and women both who are inserted in society, and we are all actually play acting and role playing and repeating a role, which we will look at greater length when we come to Butler, Judith Butler, and gender. But this role is, I would say, it is more empowering for men, and it disempowers women. So that is the problem. That is why feminism comes in. That is where feminism comes in. So it's not as if men are not inserted in society. Both men and women, as linguistically constituted subjectivities, are inserted in society. But I'll take that up a little later. So basically, what these women were saying was, and we'll again look at it at length when we are doing Judith Butler, that we are shaped by societal norms. We develop a consciousness. We are historically produced subjects, very much on the lines of what Simone de Beauvoir was saying. So, first, we have to be conscious of our position in society, which is an intersection of gender, race, caste, class, religion, ethnicity. There could be various intersections. And then we need to reflect on it and then shape our gender, construct an identity, because the earlier identity which we have been given is also a construct. So we construct another identity if we are not happy with this identity, and that includes sexuality also. The second thing which this movement focused on was not the second thing on this slide, which this movement focused on was it reclaimed with a lot of pride derogatory and pejorative and humiliating terms that were used for women. You must have all heard about the slut walk, which happened in Bangalore also, right? And so you have in this poster reclaiming the word slut, reclaiming the word witch, and other words like whore, which could be somewhat like the word Dalit. There is a very proud reclaiming of the word Dalit and then infusing it with a lot of uh, political power. So it is something similar to that. Of course, I do keep saying that third wave is all about intersectionality and some of the inspiring works and authors. I have to mention A is Naomi Wolf's The Beauty Myth, in which Wolf talks about that how, as women are beginning to enjoy social power and prominence in society, they also have to face an increasing pressure to, uh, to adhere to unrealistic social standards of appearance and physical beauty, which is a huge pressure to deal with. So, and then she goes on to discuss how in different professions, women are made to feel insecure, made to feel inferior if they don't look after themselves, if they are not well groomed. The constant monitoring of your weight on the weighing scale, the constant um, you know trial error kind of things which you do with diets, consulting dietitians, the obsession with cosmetics, and the whole fear of aging, which is again a discourse to keep women in check. So it's again a way of controlling women. In fact, she also speaks about big sized corporations, media houses, which give women who are in a very senior position or who have to face the camera, they give women a separate allowance to undergo cosmetic surgeries to keep looking youthful, to keep looking beautiful. Whereas men who are at the same senior level managerial positions feel no such pressure. She also talks about the anxiety of the middle aged housewife who is so overwhelmed by this beauty myth and who maybe who's a full-time housewife. She doesn't have time to look after herself, she's raising the children, and she's perennially insecure that her husband is going to fall for a younger woman. And there's this anxiety in her which manifests as midlife crisis, and then it could be some other physical ailment like thyroid or premature menopause and things like that. So this is a significant piece of work. And then you have Eve Ensler's very well-known play, the Monologues. It is widely performed. It is, in fact, it's become a part of the popular cultural imaginary. And what does this play do? It explores both consensual and non-consensual sexual experiences, body image, genital mutilation, direct and indirect encounters with reproduction, vaginal care, menstrual periods, sex work, and several other topics, but through the eyes of women of various ages, races, sexualities, and who have a lot of other differences. So, this would be again a landmark work defining third wave feminism. Now, moving on to some of the trajectories, which I would say especially relevant globally and also in the Indian context. So, some of the current trends. Now, this is a very interesting quote that I have over here, but I'll come to the quote later. First, I will. Oh, where is the. Hmm, okay. All right. So, okay, I had two slides, but I think I deleted one by mistake. This is ecofeminism. Now, what is ecofeminism? Ecofeminism is actually, it started somewhere in the mid 1970s, and it is an activist and academic movement that sees critical connections between the domination of nature and the exploitation of women. Both nature and women are plundered and ravaged by men or actions that are prompted by a patriarchal ideology. Ecofeminism traces a trajectory of women's close association with nature, their concern for the environment. It looks at the lifestyle which was kind of decided on or defined by women before the advent of capitalist patriarchy with its profit making goal, and a lifestyle which offered a self sustaining model and which was environment friendly and which was a part of the larger ecosystem. Now, if you consider ecofeminism, I would say Vandana Shiva is Dr. Vandana Shiva, who is a recipient of the Alternative Nobel Peace Prize, is a prominent global figure. She's a quantum physicist, but she's a very active environmentalist and an ecofeminist. And in fact, she's all over YouTube, and she's a great orator. I love listening to her, and she speaks a lot of sense. So she's very well known for her crusade against Monsanto, which has the corporation, the American corporation, which has in fact, which has homogenized, commercialized, monopolized, and corporatized agriculture. Then her organized and structured movement for preserving biodiversity and dissuading farmers from being tempted to fall into this trap which corporations lay for them and to give over their seeds for short term gains. And in fact, she is very actively engaged in the preservation of indigenous varieties of seeds and has fought a long battle for the farmer's right to own his seed and not the corporations. So these have been some of her exemplary concerns. In fact, on the slide you can see this is in fact an excerpt. I have extrapolated this paragraph from the foreword of the book Ecofeminism by Maria Mais and Vandana Shiva. And this is written by Ariel Saleh. And she says, ecofeminism is the only political framework I know of that can spell out the historical links between neoliberal capital, militarism, corporate science, worker alienation, reproductive technologies, sex tourism, child molestation, neo-colonialism, Islamophobia, extractivism, nuclear weapons, industrial toxics, land and water grabs, deforestation, genetic engineering, climate change, and the myth of modern progress, or what we call development, which all nation states are blindly engaged in, sidelining and marginalizing a lot of people in the process who they consider as expendable and not worth considering in this whole mad race for development. So in fact, it covers a lot of issues, and these could be whole areas in themselves which you could take up for your research work. And these are areas that are directly where if you work with these areas, they will have a direct connectedness or a relation, or there will be there'll be a positive impact of this work on contemporary society. So considering the thrust of ecofeminism, then it wouldn't be too far-fetched to say that activists like Medha Patkar and probably Arundhati Roy may also be perceived as having ecofeminist concerns. Because if you look at Medha Patkar, her whole fight was against the damming up of the Narmada River, the changing of her tributaries, the destruction of the biodiversity that happened in the course of this whole project, and the displacement of the population who were not kind of properly rehabilitated by the government, and who just kind of migrated to the cities and just added to the slums in the cities, who didn't know the urban way of living. So her whole fight was against that. So in that sense, she's an eco-feminist, and so is Arundhati Roy, because she also campaigns very actively against the mining projects that are happening in the heartland of India. So there are, if you consider states like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Bihar, in terms of resources, these are some of the richest states of India. But the profits are going to the corporations. The people are not benefiting. In fact, they are just being displaced. And they are what Butler calls that section of people who are not grievable. They are precarious beings, you know, if you look at Butler's theory of precarity. So in that sense, then these women could be looked upon as ecofeminists. Uh, in fact, uh, some of the yes, in fact, there's another very interesting theory which I came across in Devdutt Patnaik's The Seven Secrets of the Goddesses. There's a book he has written. He also analyzes a lot of folklore and Puranic tales from an ecofeminist perspective, closely establishing the growing connections between women's subjugation and subordination on the one hand, with the rise and correlating it with the rise of an agricultural society and the introduction of the notions of property, inheritance laws, returns, fertility, and commodification, when both the earth and the woman started being treated as commodities. They were plotted, they were demarcated, they were laying claim to. There was the whole issue of ownership over them, and they had to give returns to man. So you find this very interesting analysis in some of Devdutt Patnaik's work also. So that's ecofeminism for you. Let's look at another very relevant trajectory of feminism, which is post-colonial feminism. Now, what does post-colonial feminism say? It, of course, it's part of the third wave, so it resists all grand narratives of women's oppression. So it resists the idea of the white woman speaking for the woman in the third world, and just speaking on her behalf without putting her in a historical or a cultural perspective. So it is a reaction to the hegemonic discourse, the discourse of the hegemonic discourse of white feminism, which the woman of the third world is not able to relate to. And very key theorists in this area would be Chandra Talpade Mohanty, who has an essay called Under Western Eyes, in which she criticizes how the Western feminist movement tries to homogenize and attempts to speak for the concerns of the women of the third world without bothering to understand their unique cultural or historical context. And it just regards them as oppressed and exploited beings. Now, though post-colonial feminism derives and draws a lot from post-colonial theory, it critiques post-colonial theory too. What is post-colonial theory? Post-colonial theory looks at colonial literature from a critical perspective. The othering of the native, the internalization of the white master's ideology, the hegemonization of the Western discourse, and things like that. You have prominent post-colonial theorists like Edward Said and Franz Fanon, who you can look up to understand post-colonialism. But though post-colonial feminism draws from post-colonial theory, it says that post-colonial theory, in its attempt to focus on the native as the other, fails to address the issue of gender. So post-colonial feminism fights for agency and voice of the woman of the third world. And I would personally say that two very interesting authors would be Mahashweta Devi and Arundhati Roy. If you could study their novels, could be studied from a post-colonial perspective. Mahashweta Devi, the Gyanpith awardee, as you know, a major part, in fact, most of her life she spent, she was committed to the causes of tribal people, and she her works bring out the predicament of the tribal woman or the low caste woman who is marginalized within that village, within the untouchable community also, and how she copes with that situation. Or the woman, the low caste woman, or the Dalit woman, or the tribal woman juxtaposed against the state authorities. On the other hand, if you look at her work, uh, which was also made into a famous film, Hazar Chaurasi Ki Maa, you will find that the whole story centers around an urban woman. She's a educated, upper caste, urban Hindu woman belonging to Bengali Bhadralok Samaj. Bhadralok is the bourgeois society. She's married to an industrialist. And she has a son who embraces the cause of Naxalites, who becomes a Naxalite. And he's neutralized by the state. And she loses her son, but she can't grieve in public because it's a disgrace to the family. So it's the kind of confined existence which she is living, because despite being empowered in many other ways, despite not having to face the daily problems of trying to make two ends meet, or sourcing money or other kinds of resources to just go on living, which is the condition of a majority of people for which, in fact, the Naxalite ideology came into existence. Yet she is marginalized within her own society because she is a misfit. So these nuanced accounts could only be uh, uh, you can find these intersections and these nuanced accounts in the writings of these authors. Even if you look at Arundhati Roy, her first book, which, if I were to leave her political essays aside, which are in themselves a treasure house of the kind of they give you a very good clear picture of what is happening um, in the Indian nation state. But if you look at her first novel, The God of Small Things, she also she addresses issues of gender, caste, untouchability, and she talks about the predicament of a Syrian Christian woman whose community has internalized the whole Brahmanical discourse of caste, and how even though they are Christians, they follow the same Brahmanical rules. And her second book, which is a more ambitious political project, I would say, uh, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, if you look at it, you will find so many kinds of women with their problems, with intersections. There's a rebel from Telangana. She's turned into an Naxalite, and the kind of exploitation this woman faces, and the kind of violence she experiences and finally succumbs to. Then there's an urban woman, a city-bred woman who is a misfit in society. So she goes and lives on the margins. There are the Kashmiri mothers who don't know what has happened to their sons, who the army has taken. Then there's Anjum, the transgender, who has this incendiary border of gender running through her whole persona. So all kinds of women, and a beautiful, nuanced narrative, trying to understand the several intersections which defines the predicament of each community. Right. So just to give you a few thoughts from post-colonial feminism, in fact, why do we say that post-colonial theory fails to address gender? Because we know Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, in her own right, is a very prominent post-colonial theorist. I mean, what made post-colonialism what brought it into the limelight was Bhaba's work and her work and her seminal essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? But um, here she is stating that both as object of colonialist historiography and as subject of insurgency, the ideological construction of gender keeps the male dominant. If, in the context of colonial production, the subaltern has no history and cannot speak, the subaltern as female is even more deeply in shadow. Now, she is a particularly difficult theorist to understand. You have to literally plod through her writings. She is quite obscure. But to put this in perspective, to give you a very simple example, when she talks about the practice of sati in colonial India, Spivak gives an example. She says, what was the scene? What is sati, first of all? Sati is the upper caste Hindu practice. Of burning a widow on her dead husband's funeral pyre. Now, there was a debate in colonial India where, on the one hand, there were the reformers, the upper caste Hindu men who wanted to put an end to this regressive and violent practice. And they were urging the colonial government to intervene, to step in and pass a legislation against this practice. The colonial government, which was a white government, on the other hand, was only focused on making profits. And it was not actually interested in intervening and interfering with local rituals and customs, which would cause disturbances or which would cause them controversies, right? And then there were the revivalists who were insecure with the intervention, with this foreign government ruling over colonial Bengal. The colonial government ruling over Bengal. And they saw this kind of an intervention or an interference as an invasion of, as an attack on their spiritual and religious beliefs. So they wanted to keep the practice intact. Now, there were these three factions. So Spivak, in one of her talks, describes this as white men negotiating or fighting or resisting brown men, or brown men having a conversation or a discussion with white men over the fate of brown women. Now, nowhere in all this long-standing debate, though sati was abolished, that's a different discussion altogether. Nowhere in all this is the woman brought into the discussion. Nowhere is she treated as a subject. The person actually undergo the traumatizing experience of sati, or who has to identify with a woman who is undergoing sati, she is never brought into the discourse. She is never given subject position. So this is what, this is actually what post-colonial theory does. It completely invisibilizes the issue of gender, right? And to just give you a quote from Chandra Mohan, which is a very significant piece of work. It's just an excerpt which will give you a complete idea of what is happening. Western feminist writing on women in the third world, she says, must be considered in the context of the global hegemony of Western scholarship. That is, the production, publication, distribution, and consumption of information and ideas. So it's always that ideas have flowed from the West to the East, because there was an ideological colonization at the level of ideology also, right? And that still continues. We look up at anything that comes from the West. That's the hegemonic discourse. So she says this needs to be considered and this needs to be resisted, right? So moving on, queer feminism. That's another current trend. Now, what does queer feminism resist? It is a reaction to hegemonic. It resists two things. It resists the hegemonic white Western gay movements and activism, because you have already been familiarized with queer theory, and you know how the whole Western discourse aims at labeling, at defining, at classifying, because they love classifying people. They love this whole idea of categorizations and compartmentalization. So, queer feminism resists this tendency to confine people within certain identities. And secondly, it also resists the uh, the hegemonic feminist discourse, which is all about men and women. So it resists this, it wants to take the debate beyond this binary, beyond this masculine, feminine, or man, woman, gender binary. A prominent Indian face of queer feminism would be Nivedita Menon, and we'll go to her later when we are doing Butler. But before that, I would like you to consider these two academicians, one who have done remarkable work in tracing the queer in Indian mythology and history. Of course, Devdutt Patnaik has also done his bit, but of special interest to me over here is Madhvi Menon and Ruth Vanita. And in fact, I'm going to show you excerpts from their works, which will give you a very clear idea of how they position their work and the objective of their research. So this is Madhvi Menon, and I've taken this from her introduction to the book which she has written, which is called Infinite Variety: A History of Desire in India. So what Madhvi does in this is in fact, she traces desire and claims how desire is fluid, and she dismantles the hegemonic mathematical conversion and institutionalization of desire into matrimony or coupledom. She says desire is fluid. It is like free flowing. How can you fit it into a mathematical equation of marriage or coupledom? It is bound to overflow, right? And she celebrates all kinds of manifestations of this fluid desire between two people, three people, people of different or same genders, sexualities, or even more than three people. So, and she gives us evidence of that. She says it's all around us. It's only that we don't notice it. And in her introduction, she writes, I'm fascinated by these multiple versions of desire, because these are desires with which I grew up. All around me in the Delhi of the 1970s and 80s were Hindi films that celebrate same-sex attachments, and that's Anand. Older women desiring younger men, Dusra Admi, and cross-coupled desire, Angur. Equally, there was Bharatnatyam dance, in which the dancers played the parts of both men and women, lover and beloved. In fact, this is true for most classical dances of India. Even if you look at Kathak or say Kuchipudi, you will not find different people playing different parts. Dance ungenders. It's a beautiful space where the person who is performing does not have a gender. So you will have a Birju Maharaj performing as Radha, and he is so fascinating. You find it so fascinating to watch his performance. And equally, you will perhaps find a Shama Bhate or someone performing the Rudra avatar or Shiv. So there's just this very fluid gender transition which happens in dance. So Indian classical dance is that one space which queers or which kind of ungenders or takes identity beyond genders, which dismantles the gender binary and the rigid stable categories of gender. So to continue, she goes on to talk about Sufi qawwalis that sang of mutual longing between two men, and dotting the landscape were transgendered hijras whom we were taught to respect at all times. So I will recommend this work very strongly. You should take it up and read it, and I'm sure you'll get a lot of ideas about queer feminism. Also worth mentioning is Ruth Vanita, and this is her book, edited along with Salim Kidwai, in which she's a queer literary historian, and she traces the history and the presence, the narratives of same-sex love in India in history and mythology, and the periodization. Of course, she says it's belated, it's ancient, medieval, and modern, starting from Vedic times to present-day India. But she says something very interesting. She says we have chosen not to use the term queer, favored by many scholars today, because it is deemed wide enough to encompass any unconventional or strange sexual behaviors and self constructions. For one thing, many of the behaviors and the people in the texts we are dealing with are not only not represented as strange or deviant, but are upheld by the texts as admirable. So she says these queer identities, whether they are mythological characters or whether they are historical characters, they are objects of admiration, they are objects of adulation, they are remarkable individuals. And that is why we desist from using the word queer, which implies strange or deviant. So that's again worth a read, right? Now, taking this finally to gender, and you can see the slide. I am, of course, inspired by Judith Butler's canonical work, which is the cornerstone of gender studies, Gender Trouble. So I call it Gender in Trouble. Actually, a departure comes in the work of Judith Butler, who transforms gender from a noun to a verb. Now, what does she mean by that? She claims that we are not a particular gender, but we do a particular gender. We are not a gender, but we do a gender. So I am not a woman, but I am doing something that repetitively that makes me a woman, right? So she claims that our gender is a performance. It is recurring, it is repetitive. And this performance has to keep being repeated. So, in fact, it is a subversion. This statement itself is a subversion of identity, and she is the one who takes the discourse of gender beyond the binaries of feminism. Now, she claims that gender is a performative construct, and she wants us to pay attention to our common sense understanding of gender. Now, what is our common sense understanding of gender, considering that we are part of a heteronormative patriarchal society? What is a heteronormative patriarchal society? Which considers heterosexuality as the norm. So to put it simply, without the jargons, is that if I have a female's body, I should feel naturally attracted to a man, and I should behave like a woman, as in display characteristics or traits that are considered to be naturally feminine, like shyness, compassion, gentleness, kindness, passivity, docility, timidity, etc., etc., softness, and vice versa. So if I have a male's body, then I should feel naturally attracted to a female, and I should display masculine characteristics or traits like strength, the ability to protect, guard, chivalry, valor, courage, the ability to make, to endure physical trauma, to maybe head a war, to become a leader. So aggression, assertiveness, all that is part of my masculine behavior. Now, the interesting word over here is naturally. The thrust is on naturally. What does naturally imply? It implies the obviousness in the connection between body, behavior, and action. And Judith Butler challenges this connection. And we will now see how she proves in her hypothesis that there is actually no connection between body, behavior, and action, and how each of this is constructed. Now, before we go to Butler, we have to see where she is drawing her theory from. So we have to look a little into Lacan's contribution. Now, earlier, I did make a mention of Lacan in the context of Eline Cixous and how he claims that language is phallocentric. That is, it keeps the symbolic phallus. It centers around the symbolic phallus. So Lacan talks about initial desire before one enters the symbolic realm of language. And he shows how this desire is interrupted by the symbolic order of language, which sanctions taboos on certain kinds of desire. For instance, the incest taboo, which being central, which is the law of the father, and thereby allows other manifestations of the desire. Now, by conforming to or by entering into an agreement with this law or with this taboo, we regulate our desires and separate ourselves from our body and its needs. Language is thus, according to Lacan, crucial to the forming of our subjectivity. So, a lot of Butler's theorization is premised on this Lacanian notion of gender, in other words, of subjectivity being a result of discourse, or our bodies as historically produced entities, our identities as discursively constituted, bearing in mind intersections of sex, race, religion, culture, ethnicity, history, and the body becoming the locus of all these inscriptions. So, in other words, Lacan is saying that had we not had language as a regulatory, disciplining mechanism, right, there would be no restriction on desire. So it's only after we enter the symbolic order of language, we have this, we construct this whole idea of this is good and this is bad, this is acceptable and this is unacceptable. And that is how we shape our identity and we shape our individuality by selecting something and rejecting something, right? So the trouble with gender. Now, how does Butler look at gender? So to look at the first quote, she says, gender is not a radical choice, nor is it imposed or inscribed upon the individual. So what does she mean by this? So Butler looks at gender as the fashioning or the stylization of the body, conforming to or in compliance with societal norms. The body, to enact a performance, needs a social audience. Okay? Now, here she comes very close to Merleau-Ponty and Simone de Beauvoir, both of whom posited the idea of the body as a historical construct and a project in becoming. A process of becoming a man or a woman, which all of us do by looking at our parents and other role models in society. A way of being through the body, by marking the body. Now, there's a way I become a woman. There's a way I become a man. So firstly, by marking my body, by inscribing my body, by shaping or defining my appearance through clothes, through the presence or absence of facial hair, through the length of hair, or the makeup I use, or the makeup, or if I, or the jewelry I wear. So these are all ways of inscribing my body. Right? And secondly is the behavior, the actions that are performed by my body, how I walk, how I talk, the way I lie down, the way I interact with people, the way I sit. So all of this is a performance and enactment. So one is the body that is marked, one part, and secondly, the body that is a performer, that is a through which actions happen. So this is how I am performing my gender every moment. Now, the interesting thing is, why does she call it performativity and why not performance? Now, what do we mean by a performance? We have actors performing, we watch stage performances. Let's take, for example, Amitabh Bachchan, who performs the character of Vijay Dinanath Chauhan in Agnipath, right? So we watch Amitabh doing it and we know, we are so immersed in his performance, but all the time we know that there is a subject behind this performance, right? There is There is another person. This is not Vijay Dinanath Chauhan. This is Amitabh Bachchan, the actor. So there is a subject behind the character. There is an individual beyond this character, and this character, it's a temporary thing, and then this person is going back to being the subject he is. Now, in performativity, the notion is that there is no subject behind the actor or behind the role we are playing. So when I'm playing the role of a woman, I'm not conscious of another subject or another aspect of me. There is no consciousness in me of being something other than a woman. Though I am playing a woman every moment, every second, every minute, right? Every hour of the day and every day of my life. So that is what she calls performativity. And she shows how we think that it is voluntary. We are made to understand that it is a voluntary performance. We don't even give it a thought, right? But she says it is actually not voluntary because she believes that the gendered sex be constructed within what she calls, and here she borrows from Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, regulative discourses. What do we mean by this? These are overarching discourses that we are born into, that pre-exist us and that determine and shape us. So I'm already born into a discourse and I will be raised as per that hegemonic discourse. So I, uh, I will just try to assimilate, ad- adopt, absorb whatever is the norm, whatever is happening normatively around me without resisting it, but that doesn't mean it is voluntary. Hmm. So it's a very subtle kind of process and it's a gradual process. So in that light, then what is cross dressing? What is cross dressing? So she says cross dressing is playing around with the supposedly innate characteristic traits that define our gender. We can perform gender differently. Cross dressing says that. So, cross dressing is a resistance and reveals, it exposes gender identity as artificial. So, here I would like to take you to some similar, to simplify this, because again, Butler is another very difficult theorist to understand. Um, if you look at her second quote also, it's a little obscure. The body is itself a consequence of taboos that render that body discrete by virtue of its stable boundaries. So taboos, again taking us to the Lacanian theory, that we all enter the symbolic order and we all start following the central law, the law of the taboo of incest. And that is what stabilizes the body. We are within our boundary of operation. We have only a confined area of operation. If we deviate, then we are deviant. Okay, so here I would like to bring in Nivedita Menon, who says it more simply in her book Seeing Like a Feminist. The first statement is, she says, men and women are produced and inserted into patriarchies. I used the word inserted some time back when I think one of the students wanted a clarification. So this is what it is. Whether, irrespective of whatever gender you are inserted into a patriarchal dominant narrative. You are inserted into an ideology. Then she says gender appropriate behavior. Like if I have a female's body and if I am acting like a woman, and if I have a male's body and I'm acting like a man, gender appropriate behavior is thus inextricably linked. This is connected to legitimate procreative sexuality. So unless I act like a man or a woman, it is not going to lead to procreation. And that is why heterosexuality becomes normative. So sexuality, and now sexuality is again strictly policed to ensure the purity and continuation of crucial identities such as caste, race, and religion. So again, she's bringing intersections of um, other elements in this. And the third and the most important thing, which even Bell Hooks talks about, uh, and Althusser also talks about it, the ideological apparatus that are at work. So the institution that manages this policing of sexuality is the patriarchal heterosexual family. So it's your parents, it's your natal family, which will be the foremost in telling you, don't sit like this, don't talk like this. You're a boy, you're not supposed to cry. Hmm? You're a girl, you have to be home by 7. So it is your family. It is your parents, and that's why the family is such a convenient and wonderful institution to maintain the status quo, to maintain the hierarchy, to maintain these stable categories, to maintain what is perceived as normative. Now, Nivedita Menon goes on to say that if gender was indeed a stable category, then there would be no anxiety surrounding it. Indeed, if it was not a construct, and if gender was really natural and innate, then why the anxiety to reinforce the performance on an everyday, every minute basis? If a boy belongs to the stable, so in other words, what she's saying is if a boy belongs to the stable category of a boy, then why the anxiety if he wears a sari? He'll continue to be a boy. That itself is evidence that gender, in fact, is not stable or innate or natural or essential, but socially constructed as part of the social order. And in fact, you can actually go on to trace the works by queer literary historians who do a fabulous work, and even Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, Nordic mythology, and Indian mythology, of course, where you will see that there was no concept of stable categories of gender. You will find Krishna, who is the biggest cross dresser of all, right? Who performs his Ras Leela. Sometimes he will dress up as Radha to fool people. You have Arjun living a eunuch's life, Brihannala's life, for a year out of the 14 years of exile which they are. Then you have Chitrangada, who is a woman, but she dresses up like a man, who is Arjun's wife in Manipur. So you have so many examples. You have Amba, who takes birth as Shikhandi. So you have a very prominent queer history, visibility. In fact, even I'm not so sure whether I should use the term queer after reading Ruth Vanita, because these are really admirable characters, people we look up to. And in fact, I have to share a very interesting story with you over here. There's this episode in the Mahabharata where there's this character called Bhangashvana. And this person is cursed by Indra, that he has to live half his life as a man and half his life as a woman. So he does that. And then after he has lived out the curse, Indra asks him, what did you enjoy being more, a man or woman? So Bhangashvana says, actually a woman. So Indra says, why? And he says, A, because the sound of mother is very sweet to the ear. And B, is because a woman gets more pleasure while having sex. And you find a similar parallel story in Greek mythology. I am sure you must have heard of the character called Tiresias, who features in the half man, half woman character, who features in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. So Tiresias is asked by Zeus, the king of gods, whether he prefers being a man or a woman. And he gives the same answer as Bhangashvana, that a woman, because she gets more sexual pleasure. And this infuriates Hera, Zeus's wife, who takes away his vision and he turns blind. So these were just some examples from mythology to show you how, there was always this constant disruption and contesting of this man-woman binary. Now, I've got a very interesting metaphor for you, the metaphor of the gender unicorn, so that it becomes easier to understand what is gender identity, gender expression, how is gender different from sex and sexual orientation. So on the image, you can see that gender identity is depicted by a rainbow. And the unicorn is thinking about the symbol, the rainbow. This is because gender identity is inside us. It's how we feel about our gender. We may have been taught that male and female are the only two gender identities. This is the binary view of gender. Okay, so you have the first two arrows that look at the binary view of gender. But actually, there are many different understandings of gender. If you don't identify exclusively with being a male or a female, and instead you feel like you fit somewhere between the two, you might identify with being non binary. And many cultures have broader ideas about around gender, like the example I just gave you, than just male or female. And they have done so for a long, long time. In fact, you can check out the two spirit people in Native America also, apart from Indian mythology and Greek mythology. So then we go to gender expression. That is your action. I spoke about how you express your gender, right? So the things you do, the way you inscribe your body, the way you mark your body. So basically, what you identify. So it's outside of you, it's not in your thoughts. Okay, so this is because it is that element which is visible about your gender. And the way other people read you as masculine or feminine or a bit of both, something else, or perhaps nothing at all. This could depend on how you dress, walk, talk, act, or on your body shape or the way you mark your body. Some of your gender expressions could be your haircut, your clothing, your makeup, your tattoos, and they could change from day to day. So they are not fixed, right? Now, sex assigned at birth. What is this? Now, when you were born, it was the doctor or the midwife who assigned a sex based on your body's physical characteristics. This is a fixed category that may be different from how your gender self identity develops as you grow. So, does your birth certificate say you're male, female, or intersex or other? Most people are assigned either male or female when they are born based on their external genitalia. Now, this discrimination is based on the genitals. Some people might be classified as intersex, and Butler says the percentage of intersex people is actually 1.76, which is quite sizable. When their sex characteristics, chromosomes, or hormones are a bit ambiguous and they don't fit neatly into what we designate as male and female. But the important thing over here to understand is that we were assigned a particular sex at birth. So it's a broad kind of classification and categorization. So it's like, okay, take one look at the genitals, and it's the midwife who is kind of approving it, or the doctor who is giving the stamp of approval that this child is a boy and this child is a girl. But it has got nothing to do with our feelings. Now, how much do I feel like a man, a woman, or something else? This is my gender identity. So this is a spectrum. Because I could feel a little like a man and a lot like a woman, or I could feel maybe a bit like something else, or I could feel like none of these. So that would make me a gender, meaning I don't feel any of these gender identities fit me, and that's okay too. So we need to just chill out and relax. So, and now attraction is also presented as a spectrum because I might be a man, I could be attracted to other men or women, or maybe the other gender, or I could be a woman and be only attracted to a man, or I could be a woman and be only attracted to another woman, or a man and a woman both, or man, woman, and some other gender either. I mean, there could be so many innumerable possibilities. So we come to this conclusion that at the end of the day, gender is a spectrum. It is not pure black or pure white. It's shades of gray. In fact, it's a rainbow that we have to acknowledge. Because many people don't feel that how much ever we explain and theorize and try to define these definitions, they're not comfortable with definitions. These definitions don't fully explain either my identity or my orientation. So, yeah, queer is the kind of term which is broadly used to define people who do not want to identify with any particular definition, or who do not want to think of themselves as contained in that one label. So thinking of gender as a spectrum allows us to fully explore ourselves, our multiple selves, and also work towards self actualization and self determination without being inhibited by societal norms and societal expectations and boxing ourselves into a category and confining ourselves. So, just to give you Emma Watson's thoughts on this, she says both men and women should feel free to be sensitive. Both men and women should feel free to be strong. It is time that we all perceive gender on a spectrum and not as two opposing sets of ideas. And I'm going to leave you with that thought, right? Yeah. So that's that. That's the end of my presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Shyaonti.
Yeah. Thank you.
Indeed,
I
it was a feast for all of us to listen to you, and the way you've kind of presented the trajectory of women's studies and then gender studies, and the way you very beautifully and comprehensively pitched the queer theory into it, because we have been having discussions on queer theory and the queer movement in the West and also in India. This is an ongoing series with Dr. R. Rajrao, and we have had a couple of sessions on this. And your presentation, in fact, reiterated quite a few points which he mentioned in his session. So this was fantastic, and it was a way of sort of also recollecting what we have been doing for these many years. So definitely it was absolutely an informative and enlightening session. I'm sure there are questions and observations from our participants. So
right.
first I will, okay, you can actually keep sharing your screen so that if you wish to go back to any of the slides and
Okay.
if
I'll do
you
that.
wish to, it's entirely up to you if you wish to.
I am just having a look at the chats, but I don't see any questions. It's just
There were
thank you
observations.
so much, everyone. Thank you very much. I wish I could. I mean, this is the part where I miss a face to face interaction, right? Because I can't see any of them. Hi,
So
Sucharita. Good to
now,
see you.
and I request the participants to like unmute their audios, not
Hmm.
all at once, but one by
Hmm.
one. And
Hmm.
like if
If
you
you
have a
have
question
questions, yeah.
or observation, if it is an
Hmm.
observation, try to be as brief as possible, and same with the questions, so that others also get an opportunity to kind of share their views and their questions. So the session is open for your observations. Please introduce yourself if you have any question before you begin with the question, so that we also get to know who exactly is. Because there are more than 49 people right now with us, so it will be difficult, and we don't see all of them on the screen, even in the list.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Just checking if there's okay, there's Diksha Daryanani, and she recommends a film called A Kid Like Jake, which shows this very well. Are you talking about performativity, Diksha, over here?
Yeah, she says yes.
Okay, great. All right.
Uh, we also have Sucharita with us. And,
Yes,
Sucharita is a scholar on,
absolutely.
yeah, on mom's literature and especially the mom narratives,
Motherhood studies.
motherhood studies. So
It's such
definitely,
a privilege to have Sucharita.
yes, it would be a pleasure if Sucharita has a couple of points to
In
share
fact, if
with
she
us.
could give her expert inputs.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So Sucharita, do feel free to unmute your mic and comment. That's right. Tanya, I know this has been like so many ideas being put together, and the best part was that it was very comprehensive. Shayanti at times criticizes me and sort of says that I'm very patriarchal in my presentations very. I maintain
No,
that.
I didn't say you're patriarchal. I said you have a, you
Yeah,
are like what we are so used to,
yeah,
very
yeah.
logical and
But
very,
I must
you have a
say,
lot of clarity. And I tried to follow your style today. I
no,
didn't
but
digress
you
too much.
you are actually, at par, not at par. In fact, you are excellent in doing this, and in fact, there is a lot for us also to learn, that how how to present ideas in a very systematic manner. Yeah, Sucharita, she says, "I'm sorry, I joined and missed da da da." Okay, I
Acha,
will,
never
yeah,
mind.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So, in fact, I just had an addition to make. I was going through the chats, and if you want to look into the whole colonial period and how the woman was constructed, the upper caste Hindu woman was constructed, then I will recommend Dr. Tanika Sarkar's work, Hindu Wife, Hindu Nation. She's a historian and she has deconstructed quite a few myths. So it's a work worth reading. Those of you who are interested in post colonial feminism or interested in looking at the woman as a construct in colonial India, the upper caste Hindu woman, and the whole issue of sati, putting the whole issue of sati in perspective.
right. Shayanti, Diksha, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is
She
she
has a
on?
comment. She has a
Uh-huh.
comment. If you could, yeah,
Diksha, not just performance of gender, but how this is imposed on kids at birth, and how you mentioned that both genders have a fixed role, and how disrupting from it creates confusions. Yeah, so this is the gist of what I said, that we are assigned a sexual a category at birth itself based on our genitalia. Now, some of us continue living like that, continue complying with the category assigned to us. But what we have been assigned could be very different from what we feel from within. So sometimes it could be just that we are part of the regulative disciplining discourses and we just emulate the people in our family. And like I said, the family is the first ideological institution which reinforces this binary, right? It will tell us right from our childhood. Even while buying clothes, we buy pink for girls and blue for boys. In fact, you'll be surprised and you'll be really surprised to know that I think till 200 years ago, pink was for boys and blue was for girls, because pink is very close to the color red, which symbolizes blood and masculinity and vigor. So, uh, this is how we assign value to particular things, and this is how things are constructed. So the very fact that in 200 years we see a switch from pink symbolizing from men to going on to symbolize women or being the color code for little girls says a lot. So yes, there's a constant ideological apparatus, and family is not the only apparatus at work here. After the child begins to interact within a peer group, it could be the school, the whole education system. uh, Pick up a school textbook and it will show the mother is cooking in the kitchen. Social studies book, my child's social studies book does that. The father is working in the office. So it's always these two categories. Now they have tried to swap roles, so some textbooks do show that the mother is driving and the father is cooking in the kitchen, but then those textbooks are also hard to come by. And of course there is still nothing that addresses this issue of intersex, or something that disrupts or challenges the connection, the obvious connection which we think is obvious between body behavior and action, or sex and gender. So I think there's a lot of ground to still cover. There's a lot of awareness to be still which is still awaited, and there's a lot of consciousness raising which still has to be done.
right.
Mm.
Thank you, Shayanti. There is a question
Yes, I can see. Ma'am,
from
what is your
Kuldeep.
uh ma'am, what is your take on the nursery rhymes and the stories read to children? Now that's a whole uh, that's a different debate altogether. There are a lot of problems. It is, some of the fairy tales are full of latent violence, and in most of the fairy tales, you will see that the woman is passive. She's this archetypal damsel in distress, who is waiting for a prince charming or a knight in shining armor to come to her and rescue her. So again, it reinforces the gender binary. And similarly with nursery rhymes also, you don't see anything that is transgressive in nature. But I have come to figure out that there's a lot of violence in nursery rhymes. And another noteworthy thing about fairy tales is that the mother is generally absent. So I'm at the moment I'm working a lot in the realm of mythology and archetypes. So some feminist theorists have attributed this to again the female anxiety, the mother daughter kind of anxiety, which is like a love hate relationship. So the mother always has to be demonized, or she's absent, because the daughter has to follow the father's patriarchal order. And that's why you will find in Snow White, the mother is the stepmother and she's demonized. And also, again, you will see the beauty myth reinforced. So, in fact, you will find a lot of interconnections between what we discussed and the questions that you are raising. Yes, Bertha Mason also reminds us of the yellow wallpaper, where the woman is pronounced into hysteria and madness. Yes, in fact, Foucault himself talks about how the whole discourse around sexuality is appropriated by religion, pedagogy, and psychoanalysis. And he says that in the West, sex and sexuality is dissected and it is treated as a scientific discipline. And of course, we all know how Freud was over obsessed with attributing every kind of um, neurotic or maybe psychological disorder to some kind of sexual repression. And that is why Carl Jung completely differed from him. He said, no, all dreams are not about a release of sexually repressed feelings. So Foucault shows us how sexuality and the discourse around it is uh, sex and sexuality is actually, they dissect it like a scientific discipline, and they turn it inside out. Whereas in the East, sex and sexuality is celebrated, it is an art. And that's the whole, and it is very liberating. So that's the whole dynamics of the east versus west uh, kind of discourse on sex and sexuality.
Thank you, Shyaonti. I guess Shruti also continues with her question, but in the meantime, we also had very interesting comments from Dipti Mujumdar, who also happens to be working on Dalit women narratives and writers. So, could you just address some of her?
Yes. So through the choice of toys or even books, stories for girls, stories, absolutely, we do this all the time, Dipti. Yes. So again, similar to the color coding that we do, or that if we have to buy a birthday present, we'll buy a gun for a boy if it's a boy, and we'll buy a Barbie doll if it's a girl. So that's again reinforcing the gender binary and playing as per societal norms. So this is what I mean by hegemonic discourse, or this is maybe what Foucault means by regulative discourses. So without even seeming to be so, we are a part of it. Unless, yes, I'm a scholar or a student of, maybe gender or sexuality studies, there is no way I can figure this out, because I've just unwittingly absorbed everything and I'm continuing with it. So there's a manifestation everywhere, even in the spatial arrangement of our house, the kind of interiors we do in our house. And I think it's the middle class which reinforces this binary more than the lower class, because they don't have the luxury of this kind of, maybe interior, this kind of working on the spatial dynamics or arranging the interiors and all. And that's why there is this belief that tribal societies, in fact, are more egalitarian, where the distribution of work is not so gendered. There is a kind of switching of work. Like you can find men in the kitchen and women going and collecting firewood and men cooking. So yeah, it's only the urban societies, and yes, even the rural communities who have different kinds of confined and contained identities, who believe in practicing these norms.
Right. Also, what Shruti and Dipti have to mention is that there are these deconstruction of even the fairy tales with
Yes,
Angela Carter, and also it's a very interesting mention of Suniti Namdoshi and her feminist fables, which actually undo the very traditional
hmm,
outlook of these fables, and how
hmm,
Namdoshi sort of deconstructs that idea and presents you an alternate, or what you call it, subverts the very narrative and gives another twist to it. So these are interesting examples which are at work. But again, we do not really subscribe to, or such kind of readings even at school level. We don't really
absolutely.
produce such readings for children, and so we continue to have those conventional stories or tales,
Hmm,
whether it is at kindergarten level or even at school level.
hmm.
Suchirita has a comment, Shai.
Mm.
You could
Yeah,
just.
this one, right? A lot of fairy tales had several versions, many of which were non-normative. But the standardized versions usually are heteronormative and gender compliant.
Absolutely.
Those interested may read Jack Zipes or Marina Warner. Okay, so Sucharita, would you like to enlighten everyone a little by turning on your audio and speaking, elaborating upon it?
It would be great. And also we have Anmol Datta with us. She
Mm.
has a very, yeah, in the meanwhile,
Yeah,
good.
yeah. In the meanwhile, if Sucharita could just
Yeah.
uh, speak a little.
Sucharita, we are eagerly waiting for you to.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
I'm so sorry. I am not very familiar with the technology, the Zoom technology. So the Hangout technology. I'm sorry, this is on Hangout. Right. I just thought about Marina Warner and Jack Zipes because they've worked on a lot of fairy tales.
Mm,
And I remember doing some work on Cinderella, and there being several versions of Cinderella where Cinderella was not so passive, and the relationship between Cinderella and her the absent mother is different.
mm,
So, and the one which we read now is the one basically which has come to us through a lot of retellings, including the Disneyfied version which we see. So, somewhere along the line, the one which gets picked up and pushed onto our consciousness is the most heteronormative one. But the ones which are lost, if you kind of trace the lost fairy tales, you will find a lot of deviations, a lot of queerness. Again, I know it's a little contested term right now, but
mm.
queerness is there. And so Marina Warner has this wonderful book. I am not equipped for this today, but it's called Beast. Uh, I've forgotten the name. It starts with Beast something. It's a very thick book, but it's a wonderful read. Anybody interested in fairy tales must, you can look up the several versions because it's not always possible for us to access the original text. But she gives the several versions, and anybody interested in that can look it up, and you can see that that it's not so simple. Even like nursery rhymes and fairy tales, we just say no, that's meant to kind of reinforce gender stereotypes. That's not always true. We have made it so, but it was not originally so. There are a lot of like myths have, like, so fairy tales are a similarly interesting playground, I would say, for gender. That's it, and I'm sorry for interrupting this wonderful meeting. That's
No,
all.
in fact, you have added value to it. Don't say
No, no,
that.
thank you.
And
Yeah.
thank you so much for being a part of this. I mean, you're one scholar I look up to and I admire personally.
No, 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 no. I was determined to. Like when Sachin told me, I was like, please do invite me to the meeting. Thank you so much, Shanti. Yeah. And
Sucharita, thank
Sachin.
you
Thank
very
you.
much for your comments. Shayanti, there is a question
Hmm.
Tarangini asked, if you would like to address this question, and then
Would
probably
you
after
like to
that,
address it, in
invite.
fact? Because he for she, I think, is also about it is not also about not alienating half the population, and it's about encompassing or making amends or atonements to what the second wave did, if I'm not mistaken. So any movement, I will say, will be criticized, and then when viewed in perspective, because no movement is perfect, right? There will always be room for criticism. There will always be room for adulation. We What we need to focus on is what we as students of literature with an interdisciplinary kind of attitude, with an attitude for a larger humanitarian concern, can take away from these movements. Because there's something happening every minute, every moment. Someone is starting in some corner of the world. I'm sure you also must be getting these on your WhatsApp. Every day there's a movement where it says sign this petition and help us out, and then suddenly something becomes a rage. So it all picks up like that, and then you can take your pick, whether you would want to. But for any movement, for us to make a comment on any movement, I think we have to look at it a little retrospectively, rather than just taking diving into it, or just being judgmental about some movement. We just need for a little time to pass and then maybe make a comment.
Yeah, Shant, I think that's a very apt response to what Taranini has
Mm.
asked. And it's quite possible, like we in our enthusiasm tend to probably oversee or, over, sometimes also
Mm.
overread things. And it's
Mm.
necessary that, we have to, be able to draw our own lines while showing that enthusiasm with new movements, or also showing a kind of, anxiety with a new, idea. So
Mm.
yes, yeah, I think all in all, like this was a wonderful session, and I mean, like, I thank you a lot for your contribution, Shayanti. This is it's an eye opener for many of us, and I'm sure that students, postgraduates, as well as the research students, MPhil and PhD, definitely benefit from your discussion. So once again, thank you very much. May I request you to sort of this thing, stop sharing, so that I just have a
Mm.
slide to share with them and to
Right.
inform them about the.
So, hmm. Sure, sure. So, thank you very much, all of you who I'm not able to see and who I'm only connected with through what you have written. Thank you very much, my invisible audience today. And even if there's maybe one or two takeaways, I'm happy. And thank you so much, Sachin, for making me feel worthwhile and productive in the middle of the lockdown. So, in fact, I am expressing my heartfelt gratitude to you that you allowed me a